So it's
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Can we just kind of, we don't have to close them completely, but make them slightly less open, because there's
Yeah.
but there's a lot of horse carriages today, so it might be really loud. Okay. Hi again. Welcome to another keynote session of the Religion and the Mind conference. And now it is time for a keynote lecture by Ingela Visuri, who will be talking about the role of occulture among younger generations in her talk called Experience as a Path Towards Supernatural Beliefs, the role of occulture among younger generations. Please welcome Ingela.
Thank you.
Are you going to be walking around as well?
Yeah.
We're going to be you're a pacer as well.
I need to stand up when I'm talking, move around a little bit. All right. So I hope you got a well-deserved break. I know many of you are tired now, but I'll try to entertain you for the forthcoming hour. So I am an interdisciplinary researcher, and that means that I'm in trouble when new people ask me, what do you do for a living? I say that I'm a researcher, and they're intrigued, and they say, what do you research? And then that's when it gets problematic. So I have a PhD in the study of religions, but I'm not only in study of religions, I'm in this specific subfield that's actually called cognitive science of religion. And they're like, wow, what's that? And then I have to explain that. But I'm also an autism researcher. And people get blank. They're like, religion, autism, how do these two fit together? Because in the public mind, these represent two very different stereotypes. Religion is fuzzy and unscientific, and autistic people are portrayed as very rational and organized and sort of rule-based, and people don't see how these two fit together. But then I also explained that I'm an imagination researcher, because that's what my empirical material has led me to explore. But currently, I'm actually not studying religion at all, because I'm in play research. I'm studying live action role play and autism, and I'm also in youth studies. But mainly what I do is that I draw on cognitive theory, and I do mixed methods research, but primarily with qualitative methods, such as interviews and observations. So today I'm going to talk to you about how my journey started. It started with a question about autism and the supernatural, but I will also describe the context, which is secularity in Sweden. And then I'm planning to show you some empirical material from my research on sensory supernatural experiences, and I will describe how that relates to autistic cognition. And I will also talk about the attribution of non-ordinary experiences and the role of occulture, which is occult popular culture. And I will talk a little bit about how generation Z, Y, and Alpha are important to consider, especially in secularized cultures, when you're studying supernatural experiences. So that is the plan for today. If you don't know a lot about autism, but you've seen some Hollywood movies, I invite you to reconsider everything you think about autism. And one of my favorite researchers, who's an autistic literary scholar, James McGrath, he writes in his book, you've encountered one fictional character with autism, it's most likely a white male with savant-like ability in mathematics or science. These are not the people I study. Okay, so my journey towards studying these things, it started with a hypothesis that linked autism to atheism. And you're probably all aware of the naturalness hypothesis of religion, which proposes that mentalizing difficulties are a result of a capacity that was really useful for us to survive on the savannah, where we were underdogs and we needed to collaborate. And the extension of this sort of ability is that we can also perceive invisible agency around us in various forms. And autism is indeed an interesting case because autism is characterized by mentalizing difficulties. If you're autistic, you don't have the intuitive, quick propensity to just like mind read someone quickly. Autistic people can do it on a reflective intellectual level, like they learn it, so intelligence is an important factor in social abilities, but it doesn't happen intuitively. It takes a lot of effort. So this hypothesis suggested that autism is inversely related to belief in God. When I encountered this hypothesis, I had worked as 7 years in a special educational school where all the teenagers were on the autism spectrum, and I was teaching non-confessional religion education. So in Sweden, we learn about all religions, and we try to teach about them from a like non-confessional kind of neutral point of view. I knew many pupils who indeed had supernatural beliefs, and some of them were also very interested in conspiracy theories, which also draws on mentalization and agency detection, right? There's someone out there who wants something and has a plan. So I started wondering, like, what about those autistic people who actually do form intimate relationships with supernatural beings? How does that work for them? If these relations are complicated, how do they form these relations? So in my study, I recruited 17 young adults who all described themselves as religious or spiritual, and they were between 16 and 21 years old, so they're young adults. This is actually important because when people try to describe what I do, they always say that I work with autistic children. I don't. I work with youth and young adults, but that also has to do with the conceptualization of autism, that they're like children. There's something funny there. And they were all diagnosed before 2013, so they had the diagnosis that's called Asperger's syndrome. It means that you have good verbal and intellectual capacity. I also recruited a matched, really carefully matched, non-autistic comparison group with non-autistic young adults. And they took part in the quantitative testing only. So I used mixed methods, observations, interviews, and psychometric testing. I also call myself an autism anthropologist, and that means that I study autism as a specific culture, and I'm not autistic. I can never know exactly what it's like to be autistic. That means that I'm not the expert, it's my participants who are the experts. They are my teachers and I am their pupil. So I learn from autistic people and I collaborate a lot with them. There's a lot of interaction and learning going on. It's fabulous. I also realized that the fact that I'm not autistic means that I might miss out on important stuff if I'm the one formulating the questions. Maybe there are things going on that I'm not aware of, but that would be significant from an autistic point of view. So I designed a photographic life story interview. I gave them all disposable cameras, or they could choose to use their iPhones. And I told them to document things that were relevant to their specific worldviews, like that which you call religion or spirituality. What would that be? Would it be objects? Would it be buildings? Would it be rituals? Could it be foods? Whatever it could be. And then I developed these photos, and when we met for the interview, I just put out the photos on the table and I said, pick a photo and start talking to me about what is religion and spirituality in your life. And there were indeed surprising stuff that came out. This is an overview of my autistic participants, and about 2/3 of them are male, 1/3 is female. And as you can see, they have very different sort of religious orientations. They're Christians, Muslims, they're spiritual Christians. Those are spiritual or only call themselves psychic. One is Satanist, one is a spiritual Buddhist. But what they all have in common is that they have some sort of relationship with an invisible or supernatural being, because not all of the invisible beings that surfaced in these studies are like necessarily what we would call religious or spiritual, but they're very similar character, as we will see. My participants are not only autistic, they are also young and they are Swedish. And Sweden is sometimes called the most secular country in the world. And I would say that that is true on a societal and organizational level. So in normative terms, Sweden is super secular. If you start talking to people openly about being religious or spiritual, they would think that, well, this is totally like an irrational person who doesn't like science or doesn't like think rationally. So people tend to keep quiet about their beliefs because they would be seen as kind of odd. But there are also discrepancies in how Swedes define religion. They tend to relate religion to organized Christianity, and actually more the Pentecostal type of Christianity, where you have a really intimate relationship with God and you sort of want to talk to people about your God all the time, and like a mission when you meet new people. But we see in the World Values Survey that 72.8% responded that religion is of no or little importance in their lives. In the European World Values Survey, yet 44% confirmed that they have a personal belief in some kind of spirit or life force. So when you broaden the scope, you sort of scoop up more people. And Swedes are, I'd say, they're characterized by what Luckman calls bricolage. Those are spiritual beliefs. They tend to pick and choose a little bit, like we call it the smorgasbord principle, like you pick and choose from various traditions and you form a very individualized belief system. In a study 2 decades ago, Ulf Sjödin also found that paranormal beliefs were widespread among youths. And he had a really broad scope. He was looking at UFO, spiritualism, ghosts, and telepathy, and so on. I did a study with 2 colleagues that was actually published 4 days ago, where we looked at what we call the some and the nones. The some are those who reported in a questionnaire that they have some kind of supernatural belief. It could be, I believe there are spirits, or I believe in a God, or it could be also multiple. And then you have the nuns who tick the no box on all the spiritual or religious sort of agency concepts. When we look more closely at the nuns, at the subscale which measured religious experience, we found that 20% of them reported having supernatural experiences that involved precisely the kind of supernatural agents that they just had told us that they did not believe in. And when we also added, because we actually took out some concepts that were not like necessarily related to supernatural beings, such as a strong spiritual experience in nature, we found that there are 31% of the nuns who sort of acknowledge some kind of spiritual or religious experience. So it's interesting in Sweden. It's like an iceberg. There's a lot going on beneath the surface, but people don't tend to talk about it. That's also important to understand, like the stuff I'm going to present today. So if we start by looking at the questionnaires that my participants filled in, I had the autism group, I had the non-autistic group. And I was struck by the fact that the autism group was so much higher when it came to supernatural experiences. So 13 out of 17 reported that they had experienced the presence of an invisible spirit, and 9 of them had some kind of other supernatural experience, and 4 of them reported an out-of-body experience. If we look at the comparisons, they mainly reported a prayer response, presence of God, and that things appear predestined. If we look more closely at what types of concepts these are, you'd see that the autism group reported mainly of embodied experiences, while the non-autistic group reported more of like typically expected experiences, like I went to a synagogue and I felt the presence of God, or I prayed to God and I felt like as if I got a response. If we look on an individual level, you'd also see that there are certain individuals who are really, really high on different types of religious experiences. So for instance, David, he reported that he recognized 13 of these 15 different supernatural concepts that we presented in the questionnaire. And you also have Edgar and Gustav, you have Nina, you have Boyan. They're really high. And many of the participants, when I interviewed them, they said, I've had these for as long as I remember. I don't know what it's like not to have these odd experiences, that it's just been like that always. And you also see the comparisons, and none of them reported more than 4 types of experiences. So there was a really vast difference between these two groups. How is autism relevant then to understand this finding? Well, it's not that odd actually, because autism is characterized by atypical processing of somatosensory input. So autistic people, some of them are hyposensitive, meaning, for instance, that if you put a hand on their shoulder, they wouldn't even feel it. They're like undersensitive. Some of them are hypersensitive, which means that they are super, super attentive to all kinds of sensory stimuli. It can also vary between different modalities. So you can be hypersensitive in taste, but hyposensitive in touch. It can also fluctuate during the day. That's why people with autism, they prefer different kinds of foods that they experience as stable. So maybe if you eat pancakes in the morning and then you have pancakes in the evening, the taste is totally different. And that makes you really like anxious. And we have these predictive brains with light stability. And then they find certain kinds of food that seem to be kind of stable. Some autistic people also have a very vague sense of bodily boundaries. And I've met people who feel like, if you lie down in a bed, your body just disappears. You don't know where it begins and ends. And so one woman, she told me that she was wrapped her blanket really tight around her body. Or she goes to the gym and works out really hard because when her muscles are sore, she'd actually feel where her body begins and ends. And Tomczyk and Dunn suggested that actually 95% on the autism spectrum have unusual sensory or perceptual experiences. This is also interesting in diagnostic terms. If we look at how autism was described 100 years ago, it was actually collapsed together with schizophrenia. It was called childhood schizophrenia, right? So until in the first and second diagnostic manual, one of the criteria for getting an autism diagnosis was that you'd retreat into magical imagination and hallucinations. Then you had a shift in psychiatry where the psychoanalytical sort of paradigm was left behind. We've moved towards an epidemiological paradigm, and they separated between autism and schizophrenia. But current research is actually finding that there are correlations between these two. So these sort of analytical categories do not seem to be like, good enough. In 2017, Miles Dickinson and Smith looked at anomalous experiences, and in their autism group, 63% reported to have experienced that someone touched their body when no one was there, compared to 7% in the non-autistic group. They also found that 47% had seen shapes, light, and colors that were not caused by external stimuli, compared to 14% in the non-autistic group. So you see there's something going on here that's really interesting in relationship to religious experiences. And I will come back to that, because if we have the label religious experience or paranormal experience or spiritual experience, that's actually a matter of labeling. You have an experience, but then you have to add some kind of label to it. In the interviews, 14 out of 17 participants described experiences that they had come to label in supernatural terms. And as you can see, these refer to different modalities. And I will give you some quotes and examples so you actually get to meet my participants, because it's their voices that I'm representing as an autism anthropologist. Bojan, here's what she brought to the table. You can see that she has a picture here, which is her foot. And you can see that there's a picture here of a house. And I will tell you how these two pictures are relevant. Bojan is interesting, just like the total majority of these participants. She had grown up in a fully secular home where there was no religion. But once she went to an excursion with her school, they went to the big mosque in Stockholm, and she was totally struck by the building and the practices, and she ended up converting to Islam, and she learned Arabic, and she learned the whole Quran, and was really invested in Islam. But she also described herself as psychic. So let's look at how she describes this first picture. I have a picture of my foot. I should actually have my toe in the picture. I was lying on the couch sleeping, and then suddenly my toe was pinched. No one else was at home. I pinched like this, properly, like ouch. So it was my friend Cassandra from the other side who was spooking again and pinched my toe. And Cassandra was a friend she had when she was a child, and this friend died. But she experiences that Cassandra comes back to visit her. Then about this eerie house, she told me about when she had gone to another city with her family to visit relatives, and they lived in this house, and she felt immediately that this house was eerie, and she heard some weird noises in the evening. And then in the morning when she woke up, she heard someone walking outside their bedroom. In the morning, I heard footsteps like this. It had this weird walk. No one else was awake. It was just Mom and me. Dad was asleep. Then I got really, really scared. And she was like totally convinced that there were evil spirits in this house. I didn't have the Quran with me, and since my parents were in the room, I couldn't pray to Allah, because then I would have to go out of the bedroom to pray, but that was where the evil force was. You know, her parents are not Muslim. She feels like odd about doing Muslim practice, but this is interesting how she sort of, fluctuates between these two identities of both being psychic and being a Muslim. Another of my participants, Edgar, also described that he had had multiple experiences of the supernatural, and once when he was in the shower, he suddenly sees the palm of a hand on the shower glass like this. And he just, he looked around, and it was a bit foggy, with these glass walls, and he called hi, is someone there? And he actually walked out of the shower, and he opened the door, and he shouted to his family, hey, did someone go into the bathroom? They're like, no, we haven't been in the bathroom. And that really freaked him out. And he said, all human hands, when you take water and you do it like this, then there's always space between the joints, but these weren't there. It was the whole hand, it was a full mark. So that was a little weird. And then I got a little scared because I'm not that happy about having ghosts in my house. And there was no one who had died, so I don't know. It only happened once. This sentence comes back in all my interviews. When something weird happens, they ask themselves, who do I know that has died? If they can identify someone who died, like it's my grandmother, then they can relax because it's a nice person. But he couldn't identify who it was. He didn't know anyone who had died, right? And that made him freak out. Gustav is another one who's had a lot of paranormal experiences. He was very much of a seeker, very spiritual. He liked Buddhism, and he had this little altar in his room. I took this picture. And once I was in his home, we were filling out questionnaires, and then suddenly he says, now they're here. The spirits are here. I'm like, wow, okay. Do you see them? And he said, no, I don't see them, but I feel them. They're out there in the hallway. He said, I don't see someone standing there. I feel it. But we just talked about spirit vibes, and I get a sensation that someone is standing there now. And I'm interested in mentalization, and that means that you also attribute thoughts and goals to the supernatural agents. So I asked him, so why are they here? What do they want? And he said, do you know what? They're here because they're super annoyed with my brother. His brother is apparently super messy. And also he said they get annoyed because they live first, but then when they die, they are restored. But they somehow still live in their past experiences. They live as souls, so to speak. And if they see anyone doing anything stupid, they get really annoyed, and I can understand that. And the annoying person in this case is his brother. So they're basically there to tell his brother to shape up because he doesn't take responsibility for his life. So that's, I think, is a perfect case of how you attribute thoughts and aims to supernatural beings. I'll also tell you about Katsi. Katsi was the one who directed me towards these characters that we wouldn't typically maybe call supernatural, but they are still invisible and they still impact her life. I mean, for me, okay, so the question was like this: what does religion and spirituality mean to you? That was like my first question before we started looking at the pictures. She said, I mean, for me, it's spirituality, if I'm anything, because I don't believe in religion a lot. I mean, quote unquote, real gods or anything like that. But for me, it's more games and things that I find in movies that are more interesting. But if it's anything, then it's spirits or, well, spiritual stuff. Katsi didn't use a camera to take photos. She asked me, can I instead bring my laptop? Because what I'm about to show you is better like to view on a laptop. And she took out a picture of this goddess from the computer game Elder Scrolls, and her name is Nocturnal. Nocturnal is kind of mystical in a confident way, and still you know that if you would make her angry, all hell would break loose. But still, if you do her bidding, you know that you always have that extra luck that you need, which in my experience playing Skyrim has helped me many times, actually. So she feels as long as she's doing the bidding of this goddess in the game, she reciprocates and helps her back. So this is actually a mutual experience for her. She also told me a story about a beloved Rottweiler that died. At my former school, I was kind of forced to watch a horror movie for the first time of my life. And it wasn't that fortunate, so to speak. And I was really, really scared. And then I felt when I was lying in my bed that there was something that kind of, I mean, it wasn't scary, but it was more of a safe weight by the end of the bed, just like the dog used to lie when I was at my auntie's. It felt as if he protected me. It was just like a safe spot that I could turn to. So again, you have some kind of anomalous perception, but you identify the agent. It's a dog that you loved and you feel safe. When I looked through my empirical material, I had Muslims, I had Protestant Christians, I had several Catholics, and while they were talking about God, when we were just talking about supernatural relations, they never once attributed these experiences to God. No one said that it was a God or an angel or not even a jinn, right? They were just talking about spirits and ghosts and even demons. And I spent a long time wondering what is going on in this material? Why is God not present anymore? I think that the reason is occulture. Christopher Partridge, who's a historian of religion, he coined this term occulture to describe occult popular culture, which he means is present in popular culture. It's actually really pervasive. You have fantasy literature, you have horror movies, anime and manga, role-playing games, live-action role-play, occult reality TV, and you also have para-religion. There's so much occult and spiritual stuff in popular culture. And Christopher Partridge, he argues that this forms a plausibility structure that people use to make sense of their experiences. So I also, when I discovered this concept of occulture and I went back to check the material, I could actually see that they were sometimes explicitly referring to popular culture. Anastasia, for instance, describes an evening when she was out walking with a boyfriend and they walk by this car and the windows are a bit foggy, and when she looks into the window, there's something really weird sitting in there. So we walked past it. And then when we were about a meter away from the car, then we both saw, then the person sitting in the car turned around and looked at us, and the face was deformed. It was like the mouth was a huge hole and the eyes too, like in a scary movie. So you see all these, actually, there were references to popular culture in the material. Another historian of religion, Kara Cusack, she argues that since the mid-20th century, fictional narratives have been used to affirm ultimate concerns for certain people, making fiction fulfill the roles and functions of religious texts. Imaginative practices such as visual and performing arts, reading and viewing fiction can provide alternative meaning templates that are now understood by some to meet requirements that were once considered unique to religion. For this to occur, the fictional text must draw upon and reflect human concerns and afford space for contemplation, so individuals can devise or extract personal meaning from the story. And I think this is what happens a lot in these stories. As I said before, my participants, they're not only autistic, they are not only Swedish, but they are also youths, right? And they are what they call digital natives. They were, in fact, millennials. I'm part of the Generation X generation. We grew up the first part of our life without internet, but then we have generations that come now and they consume a lot of popular culture, mainly through the internet, but also streaming on Netflix and so on. So I'd say that this is also like a generational shift in supernatural attribution, especially in secular cultures where people don't talk about God, right? But you have talk of other supernatural phenomena. And my participants, they talk a lot about reading fantasy fiction, watching horror movies, and also computer gaming. Ian Hacking once wrote that once autistic people can handle a keyboard, many of them can explore a space where you never actually need to confront anyone face to face. And that also makes sense in relation to supernatural beings. I argue that they are actually easier to mind read because you don't have any messy bodies that interfere with your interpretation. Because as I said, autism is characterized by atypical sensory processing. It also means that sensory input fluctuates a lot, right? And that makes it really hard to communicate with people. Many of them say that social interaction is too fast-paced, they don't have time enough. But when you do it online or when you do it with supernatural beings, you have all the time in the world. You can actually pause and you can think about it and you can sort of, reflect a little bit. So even if it's not like the intuitive type of mentalization, they get access to the reflective type of mentalization that suits them better. I also think you will probably listen to Tanya in a few hours, and I love Tanya's work, and it matches my work really well. And she talks about the cultural kindling of experiences. She talks about how this is a learning process, how people learn to pay attention and eventually cultivate an inner landscape. And she calls this let's pretend. So she sees a similar process in her American evangelicals, that you actually, this is something you practice over time. It's not always that you have an experience and then you just label it, but it actually happens over time. And especially if you have cultural input that encourage you to do so. And she also calls these shared imaginative worlds that we find in popular culture paracosms. You probably also know that we have a really interesting predictive paradigm going on now, which talks about the predictive mind. And I would like to illustrate through a study that my colleagues in Aarhus conducted. This is the God helmet that you may have heard of, with me trying it on. And Mark Anderson, Uffe Schött, Christopher Nilbo, and Jesper Sørensen, they did a study where they compared spiritists, New Age, and experienced. They put on the helmet as a method for priming them to, expect that once you get into this room, you will have some sort of anomalous experience. There was actually nothing going on with the helmet. And then they put them in a room that was sensory deprived, right? And that's when people often start hallucinating. And they did indeed find that people experience stuff that matches their expectations of possible things that you might experience. So one spiritist, for instance, when they interviewed them afterwards, said, as a spiritist then was defined as someone who believes in spirits and practices those sorts of traditions. I clearly sensed that I was making contact with the other side. I sensed a masculine energy. When you walk past a person, it feels like there's a wind of sorts. That's how it felt, except it felt more constant. One of the New Age practitioners said, all of a sudden, I saw planets that flew past me. I could see it, Saturn and Mercury. I both felt it and saw it. It felt like an enormous expansion into something infinitely great. And those who were inexperienced, who didn't practice anything spiritual or religious, one of them said, I felt something that mildly pushed against me. It was like an animal that tried to get in under my clothes. It was like a snake pushing itself against an isolated area. So you see also in terms of attribution, this is like, it felt like a snake, not very supernatural. Then you have these new agey planets, and then you have what you feel, it must be someone from the other side. So it actually influences what you experience. So once you start, like if you have an experience and you label it in supernatural terms, you're more likely to experience more similar experiences. So there's kind of a loop between expectancy and experience, and I argue that occulture is part of this loop. How long time do I have? 20 minutes?
About 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Actually, probably 25 if you started slightly later.
Yeah, I don't think I need 25, just so I'm not like pushing things. I don't think it's enough with culture and a sensory sort of propensity to experience things. I think you also need to want it. You want to embrace it. I found among my participants that they were fantasy prone. And fantasy proneness is a personality type. You can either be born with it, that you sort of have this tendency to really absorb into stuff. You get this really good flow, or you watch movies and you forget that you're actually sitting in a sofa. You feel like you're in the movie. And among fantasy-prone people, you also find frequent daydreaming, vivid sensory perceptions. They're more prone to hallucinate, for instance. Many of them have imaginary friends and paranormal experiences. And I argue that maybe the people that I found, my autistic participants, they were attracted to the supernatural because they are fantasy-prone. So maybe autistic individuals who are not fantasy-prone would be less likely to embrace these kinds of concepts. So let's get back to Anastasia, who walked by this car with a different face. She told me a lot of scary things, and like she said, I'm in my living room, and suddenly like books start falling out of the shelves, and there were a lot of things going on, and she had her Catholic cross on the wall of her bedroom to sort of protect her. And then I asked her, would you prefer not to have these experiences? Would you prefer it if it all went away? And she said, I'd say that it's somehow exciting. I mean, the adrenaline when something like that happens, when I'm all alone in the bathroom and someone whispers, hey, you, in my ear. I mean, I get really scared and I run out of the house, but that means that I'm paying them attention. I react to it and they know it, the spirits. And it feels uncomfortable, but I get this adrenaline, so I go back and I'm like, hello, to see if I get a response. And even if I get terrified, I always go back to see if there really is something. So she likes it. She likes the kick of these experiences. And I think this is also an important factor. I can also see, like when I did field work, these are kids who love this sort of thing. This is when I was there. I happened to arrive at Halloween, and you can see how they've been preparing for months, making costumes and hairdos and everything like that. So I'd say that autistic people, like the fantasy proneness, can also develop as a result of trauma or loneliness. And we see that a lot in autistic people, that you sort of retreat into an imaginary place where you're in control and you have sort of kind companions and things. But if I guess, I think fantasy proneness is quite widespread across the autism spectrum. We also see these borderline phenomena. They're not supernatural, but they kind of consist of the same stuff. I don't know if you've heard about tulpamancy, but it actually developed from the, have you heard about bronies? Yeah, so they're like bros who like My Little Ponies. There was a community online with like My Little Pony fans who were all male, and they're like, yeah, but I still like love this universe. It's not just like that they like the ponies, they like the whole narrative and this whole like parasocial. And they started practicing a Tibetan meditation technique where you emanate sentient, invisible companions. And the ultimate goal is to practice it so much so that you can eventually see and hear them outside your own body. And this has developed into a subculture that is called tulpamancy. And these are all like independent people. Like so some people say that, yeah, so I'm on the autism spectrum, but my tulpa is not. And they could argue about things. And they also have like a mind palace or their own universe. Sometimes the tulpas retract. So the idea is that the tulpas were always there, but I just emanated one of them to be my tulpa, my companion. But they have sort of a life of their own. Samuel Visuri, he wanted to check so this wasn't sort of caused by schizophrenia or psychosis, and just happened to discover that 25% of the tulpamancers in his study, they were on the autism spectrum. And you can compare that to the general population, which is about 2.5% who are autistic. So that's quite radical. Then Jacob Eiler, he replicated the study and he found 27% of his participants were autistic. I'm not sure, maybe Tanya will talk more about tulpamancy, but this is also an interesting phenomena. They wouldn't call it religious or spiritual, but it's very sort of, you probably recognize it like from other practices that we would call that. So I'm gradually starting to wrap things up. I argue that how do secular Swedes come to form supernatural attributions and experiences? It happens through, you have an anomalous experience, and then you have the cultural framing of a culture, and you also have motivation. I should not say Swedes, I should say the Swedes in this study, right? Because there are various pathways. But I think that it is sort of the body that drives them towards religion and spirituality. So it doesn't come from like intellectual thinking, it comes from bottom and then it rises up. And this motivation is also what trumps secular norms. So my argument is that there seems to be an intergenerational shift in supernatural attribution. And this is important, an argument from Ann Taves. If we want to understand how anything at all, including experience, becomes religious, we need to turn our attention to the processes whereby people sometimes ascribe the special characteristics to things that we, as scholars, associate with terms such as religious, magical, mystical, spiritual, etc. So it's actually a matter of labeling. There's nothing innate about an experience that makes it supernatural. It's how we relate to it linguistically. I chose these three pictures because these are stuff that my kids are terrified about. And they claim to have seen all of them. So I have a 10-year-old and I have a 13-year-old. They've seen the Slender Man. They actually saw Slender Man in the park and they were totally convinced. They've also been chased by clowns, right? And one of them has a phobia for dolls. Like if he sees a doll, he's like, oh, I have a phobia. And of course, this comes from horror movies and popular culture, right? Like, I don't think anyone, like when I was a kid, no one ever saw Slender Man because we didn't know Slender Man existed, right? So finally, I want us to consider how this impacts research on religion and spirituality methodologically. I think we need to cast a much wider net in what we describe as religion and spirituality, and maybe if there are related phenomena. Because if we only ask about very traditional behaviors, like I go to church, or I fast during the Ramadan, or blah blah blah, I do these things, or I believe there's a God, I believe in ancestor spirits, I don't know. If people say no to them, that doesn't mean that they don't believe in other things. So I think we really need to reconsider our operationalization and how that takes shape in like questionnaires and interviews. I'm also quite concerned about social desirability, because especially non-autistic people have this tendency to tell stories that other people want to hear, right? If you have empathy scales that we talked about for yesterday, it's not like a lot of people were like, no, I don't care about people, I'm a very unempathic person. Right? People don't say that because it's not normative. And I have a quote from Andrew. Andrew loved the Harry Potter universe. He read all the books, he saw all the movies, he was in this internet community for Harry Potter fans, and he said, until I was 14 years old, when I finished reading the books about Harry Potter, I believed in unicorns. But if I tell people that I'm both autistic and I believe in unicorns, they would think that I'm really crazy. Because he probably tried it, right? He tried it, he told someone. And the stories that I shared with you today, almost none of them have been heard by people who these participants know. They don't share them with people because they don't want to come through as irrational and stupid in secular Sweden, right? So I think we also need to consider, like, how do people respond to our questions? Also, if we have questionnaires, autistic people tend to be much more, precise. Like, what does this question actually mean, and how does this relate to me and my life? Well, non-autistic people, they're not like, yeah, like this. So it's really hard to compare quantitatively. It's also in experiments. Autistic people, they tend to get really insecure. I know this, I was a teacher for 7 years. If you give someone a task like this, they just sit and stare at it and like, what does she want from me? Yeah, I want this and this, but it can take like a long time, because they're not sure about what is right and wrong, and they're very concerned about doing the right thing. Well, my non-autistic pupils, they just take it and just do it, right? So this also has an impact in when we study autism. Final slide. We often talk about 4E cognition. We talk about that. Cognition is embodied in culture, extended and enacted, but I really think that we need to take this seriously. I think there is a tendency to think that religion comes sort of from top down. We have a tendency to think of it in, at least in like the Western world, very much like in a Protestant term, like it's, do you believe in God? It's like Andrew, what he said, like, I don't think unicorns exist nowadays, but I still believe in them. That's an interesting invitation, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ingela. And now it's time for your questions and comments. So please, the floor is open.
And I do feel like you need to come up here if you're uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's no need to do that. It might be slightly easier for the people online. There's no, of course, no pressure. Traditionally,
You might come up.
I will come up.
Yeah, should I sit? Where should I sit?
I don't know.
I'll stand.
First of all, Ingela, thank you for doing a whole presentation about my youngest daughter.
Really?
Yes, really.
Wow. It's fantastic.
Yeah. But more substantively, it was wonderful to see you also referring to entails. I'm wondering, are you familiar with the tool that she's just developed for looking at unusual experiences that may potentially be deemed to be religious, where she pulls apart the fact that they are unusual and how they are interpreted? Because it seems to me like this is a tool that's wonderful for your kind of research.
Yeah, I know that she has developed it, but I haven't had time to look at it because I'm not studying religion at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do like about Ann Taves and also Egil Aspren, that she's collaborating a lot with, is how they talk about how we need to reverse engineer and pick sort of concepts apart and maybe look at them separately.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thanks for reminding me. I'll definitely look at that.
Okay.
I really like Ann Taves' work.
Me too.
Yeah, and also her focus on experience.
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is something that I find very interesting. I think I've said this before, perhaps even here last year. How it's interesting that the cognitive science of religion has mostly not looked at experiences, where I've had this sneaking suspicion that it's because of the way in traditional religion studies, religious experience is very heavily theorized in ways that cognitive science of religion just finds completely anathema.
Yeah. And I also think it's interesting, like going back to William James, like how does the individual understand and interpret the experience, right? Like we don't have to question, like you have this ethic academic perspective, but then you have the emic personal perspective. Like their emic language is interesting, I think, and also taking their concepts seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can elaborate on them and sort of analyze them. But I still think that it's interesting, like how we use these different labels. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. It was fascinating. I'm wondering if, considering this autistic religiosity, do they spontaneously elaborate ritualistic behavior?
Yeah, good question.
If you're asking a question from that, can you like really speak up, or maybe you can repeat?
Yeah, I'll repeat it. Yeah.
Oh,
that's why you want people to come up. It's for the sound.
It's not like we want to mock them,
Thought it was like a shaming ritual. You get up here and try to say something smart. Yeah, so about ritualistic behavior. I had two expectations that didn't come true. And the first one was I thought they would be very attracted to ritualistic sort of religious behaviors and the stuff that happened there. And when I asked them, they said, well, I have a lot of rituals, but none of them are related to my concept of religion or spirituality. So they were very individualized in how they did things. And also I thought that many of them would be attracted to religious communities. Because I was thinking that it's like an including atmosphere and you know what to talk to people about, like socializing gets a little bit easier. And everyone except one who was a Coptic Christian, he was the only person who was really invested in his community. None of the others were. And what they said was that I'm not prepared to go into a congregation where there's a set of beliefs and I'm supposed to embrace all of them. Like, what if I don't agree with something they say? Like, I can't just accept stuff because other people expect me to think the same way they do. So they were doing stuff and thinking on their own. So yeah, that was actually surprising. I thought they would be more ritualistic in terms of this framework, but they weren't. Yeah.
Dave?
And it's a related question about the imagistic doctrinal. I mean, I don't know if that's the best distinction, but it might relate because you said they kind of resist a lot of like over sensory kind of stimulation.
Yeah.
So the question would be, would autistic people be more likely to kind of gravitate towards doctrinal modes, if you know what I mean? Because they would avoid like all the kind of stimulation involved in like
Yeah, I think.
imagistic.
Yeah, I think both yes and no. So the like doctrinal and imagistic idea by Harvey Whitehouse, right?
Yeah.
So I think they're more imagistic in terms of having super strong experiences that are very memorable, that would be ingrained in their like episodic memory, and they'd think a lot about it and then never forget about it. But then there were some of them. No, I wouldn't say. I only saw this specific participant who was very doctrinal about his like Coptic congregation and very sort of loyal to it, and the others weren't. But 3 of the participants were also what I call more existential thinkers, and I mean, being autistic is a challenge. People have a lot of anxiety. You even see like really high suicide rates in autism. People are lonely and they struggle, and especially those who are diagnosed late in life, you know, they spend their whole lives wondering, like, why do people just like deal with these things so easily? Why am I so odd? Like, I can't handle it. And they use religion to sort of navigate around that kind of anxiety, or maybe have God as a sort of a partner to speak with, or just to like, okay, one guy, for instance, he went for long walks in the woods, like talk to God, and he didn't feel like God would respond like that, but he felt that God always listened and always cared for him. But I also think this is a Swedish effect, right? Because we're taught not to be doctrinal. We don't like authorities. We like, it's a very libertarian society. We're very individualistic, and we're taught to think for ourselves and question things. So I think I can't really say anything about the larger autism spectrum. I think it depends on the culture, actually. The learning, like you talked about. Yeah.
Maybe I'll have a question then. And I mean, first, actually, I wanted to have a short comment to what Konrad said about the study of experience in CSR. It's not exactly like, it's not like there's no interest at all. I know there's some like within the 4E paradigm, for example, Larry Barcelou and colleagues, I guess, you know, they have this kind of trying to do also this kind of neurophenomenological approach to actually, you know, experimental study of experience.
Sure.
So yeah,
but most often you hear about religious beliefs and practices.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, of course. But so I mean, this is also
Yeah.
like, once again a 4E thing, right? So within this framework, I think there's an attempt to also approach experience in a non-trivial way, not just purely, you know, I don't know the neuro correlates. But anyway, the question I have is like it's a general question about autism, and so it's not specific to this. But maybe you can explain something, because what really drew my attention is this bodily boundaries, like the blurriness of the bodily boundaries. And I have a question because there's this, it's almost like probably a stereotype thing, like with the story with Temple Grandin inventing the cow hugger.
Yes,
and the necessity
that relates.
to be,
Yeah.
so does it have to do with building the boundaries for the body?
Yeah, I think so. But also, so Temple Grandin, she's a professor in animal science. She's one of the most famous autistic persons around. She worked in a farm, and she was observing cows. And she saw that when the cows are anxious, they start moving in circles, and they also squeeze tight, really tightly. And so what she did, this made her do 2 things. The first is that she has actually designed, do you say slaughterhouses? It sounds so horrible, but you know where you make the beef.
Yeah, I guess it's abattoirs, like this fancier.
Yeah,
not so first hotel.
Yeah, but you see what I mean. She designed them in circles so the animals would be less anxious once they come to like the bitter end. right? But then she also designed a squeeze machine. So when she got super anxious, she'd stand on all four and she'd pull a string, and this machine sort of pulls her body really, really tight together, and that would relieve her anxiety. But I think that's like more of a general thing also, like, you know, kids when they're anxious, they want like a tight hug, they want to come close to the body. And maybe it's like enhanced in autism, I don't know. But also you have autistic people, some of them don't like others to touch them, but a machine is okay. Yeah.
This is the argument I've heard with I think Temple Grandin actually used this precise argument.
Yeah.
You want the other person to touch you, but you need to touch. But also it's like interesting with the with the body boundaries.
I haven't actually seen any study on that. I have that story from people I've met. But I could also see in the quantitative data that I had 4 persons who reported an out-of-body experience and 0 in the non-autistic group. So I think that also relates to like that. Yeah. Thanks.
But there are no studies on like the sensory aspect of autism.
Oh, there's lots. Yeah.
Sleep paralysis and the hallucinations you get with that, common among?
Common.
Yeah.
So Anastasia, for instance, she told me of an incident where she got sleep paralysis. So you know when you're sleeping, the body's supposed to be locked, so you can dream that you're running, but you're still like lying like this. But sometimes when you wake up, the lock is still on, so you're kind of awake, but you can't move the body, and that's when people. So the word nightmare comes from the sense that you get anxious. You feel like the nightmare is sitting on your chest, and people tend to see shadows sort of leaning over them, and it can be a really terrifying experience. And Anastasia told me of one such incident where she was lying paralyzed in a bed and awake, and she saw someone, like a horrible man, leaning over her, and his breath smelled like rotten meat. And that's apparently very unusual in sleep paralysis. Unusual smells. Horrible breath. It was just hanging over me like that. But it's common in autism.
Pavel first, and then we come back.
No, just a quick question, because we are talking about other. I want to ask you, do you know something? There's some research which connect or some research which shows that there is also something which is called aphantasia, which is an ability. It means that people are not able to visualize imagination.
Yeah, aphantasia. Yeah.
Do you have some information that there is some study which found that autism?
I don't, but it's a good question. So aphantasia means that you're unable to think in pictures, right?
And this is
You can fantasize verbally, but you can't like see it in your mind's eye.
It's actually recently huge topic because it has been found that it's not so small percentage of people who have aphantasia. So maybe it's also found.
I'm actually planning a research project now with my colleague David Tuve, where we want to look at inner thinking. You know, so some people think very verbally, some people think visually, some have auditory thinking, some have just emotional thinking, and we're wondering how that relates to your perception of supernatural beings. So that might be an upcoming study that we have. But it's fascinating, like, to imagine what it's like not to ever think in pictures. Yeah, but it's a good question. I'll actually look that up in autism.
To ask, if you, like, for my ethnographic work, like, also about some kind of supernatural experience with spirit itself, I found that my informants, they always use the unusual somatic experience as justifying the authenticity of the experience. I was not, it was not like, I wasn't hallucinating because I felt this is like something which, and they always try to emphasize the discrepancy between the sensory exteroception and interoception that did it often comes first, the
Yeah.
body feelings, like they say like, when people like had some experiences which were similar to the narrative tradition in the community, they said like, no, this wasn't real because the fear didn't come first.
Yeah.
So they use it also as a counter evidence when it wasn't considered real experience with the spirit. But
yeah, I think that's really important. I don't know, Chris Freeth, who's a professor in cognitive science, he writes about how we rely a lot on our sensory impressions. Like that's how we navigate in the world. We see things, we hear things, and that like enables us to move in different directions. And also like Tanya Luhrmann, how she writes that, you know, you're in this house and someone tells you that it's haunted and suddenly you get goosebumps all over your body. And that's almost like empirical evidence that magic is real, right? So we tend to rely a lot on like our sensory perception in real making.
Yeah, and also I found out that people use it like when they narrativize their experiences. So because there is like a huge cultural disbelief. The narratives I collected are usually considered like superstitious, but not in context of kind of secularization, but because of like strong Catholicism.
Yeah.
It's like you are like this is like heresy what you're telling.
Yeah.
So, but if you add additional evidence like this was real, I found it like and so on.
Yeah.
It was like convincing an instrument to convince your audience about the reality of the experience.
Yeah. But I also think there's a generational shift in like what frameworks you draw on. So what we see in generation Z, Y, and Alpha are that they are more prone to sort of mix identities. So when I was younger, you'd either be like a punk rocker, or you'd be the rock guy, or you'd be the sports girl, or whatever. You'd have one identity and cling to it. But for them, as we see also in this material, it's not problematic for them to be, I'm like Muslim, I'm psychic. It's like totally unproblematic. And they tend to sort of shift between different frameworks and mix and match them, which may also be a result of this individualization that we see globally that's increasing.
Back to Conrad.
Sorry.
No.
It's just that we've done a pilot study on sleep paralysis, which had an interesting result that I think is highly relevant to autistic people, right? Because we found that people who had experiences of sleep paralysis, they indeed were more likely to have supernatural beliefs.
Yeah.
And the thing was that we had a sample which was very high in terms of education and very high in terms of need for cognition. And what we did was we looked at people who had the very highest need for cognition, right? And what we found there, that what the aspect of the sleep paralysis experience that was very much correlated with stronger supernatural beliefs wasn't, feeling presence, all those other things that were important for the massive people that way were studying. But then it was one thing: pain.
Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of pain?
But basically we had a questionnaire where there was a number of different aspects of the experience, and did you experience pain during this?
Yeah.
Yes. Boom.
Well, and that relates back to what you said about the bodily experience, that pain is like, and it's like also Boyan, how she said that someone pinched my toe, like, ouch, I felt it, it was like,
yeah.
So that's probably, because some of them, like one of these guys, he told me that he had his cousin stay over, and his cousin was on a mattress beneath his bed. And then he was lying like this, and he felt someone like poking his back, like this. I thought, oh, it's my annoying cousin. And he turned around and was like, oh, my cousin is asleep. And then he started thinking, who do I know that died? Like they all did. And he's like, yeah, I had this, I had a little bird, like what do you call them, like this little canary bird.
Mm-hmm.
and it died, and you had this whole story about how sad it was when the canary. I said, maybe it was the bird coming down and just say hi to me. And I've heard similar stories in my master thesis as well, like, you know, little. But then he said, I'm not convinced. It might have been just that I made it up, because it was just a light touch. Maybe I just made it up. While those who like really feel it, it's much more convincing.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just one sentence to this. Like I also feel like the pain, maybe like the especially strong pain, maybe the experience that is really real for people, like you know, hard to fake. It's also with some, you know, psychosomatic disorders, like people have really difficult time to believe that the pain they feel may be just because of, you know, some psychic problems that they experience, and not because of some actual, you know, somatic disease. So I guess that's maybe also the link, that this is like really feels real for people. Like there has to be something going on. That's if pain is involved, right? So that was just to
but I agree. And I like Tanya Luhrmann's concept of real making. This is a process of real making. And the body is involved in that process.
And just one other comment. Have you come across it's called the interactive religious experience model by Mikhail Banel? So I guess because for me it felt like really a good, you know, theoretical approach. And here, like they talk a lot about this, you know, bottom-up experiences where you have those low-level intuitions and how they form the basis for your personal beliefs and stuff. So that it just feels like a good, you know, theoretical.
I totally agree. And my work is very like aligned with what Michael is doing, and we sort of agree on things. Our frameworks.
So that was just.
But I totally agree. Thanks.
Thank you. And great talk.
I guess you're all tired and maybe hungry.
So I think we can thank you very much once again, and we can wrap the session up.
And thanks for great questions.
Thank you to Ingela. Thank you for all your